Thank you very much, Tobias. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How was lunch? Good. That was very positive. People sometimes say there's no such thing as a free lunch, but there is at Google, which is great. So my name is David Liversidge, and for the last 3 years, I've been leading a program at Google called Online to Store. The objective of Online to Store is to help our clients and agency partners understand the role of online research in driving offline sales into call centers, stores, and branches. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus both on this online to offline effect, as well as on the phenomenon of multi-screening, because we believe that these are two of the biggest challenges, two of the biggest measurement problems faced by online marketeers today. But before I start, I want to do a quick validation that you're in the right room and that I'm in the right room. So please, could you raise your hand if you believe that multi-screening and research online purchase offline is a big issue for your organization? Lots of hands. Could you please keep your hand up if you think that you have solved it in a robust way? Not very many hands. I'm delighted by that, because if lots of hands had stayed up, I would have bid you a very good afternoon, gone straight back to the airport, and probably sent my CV to you afterwards and asked if I could have a job in your organization. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about the way that Google has been thinking about this problem. And if there's one message I'd like you to take away from my presentation, it's that although I don't think we've solved it, because it would be arrogant to claim that we had, I think we're a long way down the track. And I'd like to talk about some of the platform solutions that we've been developing to help our advertisers and agency partners solve this big problem. But to kick off, I'd like to show you a short film, really to bring this to life, get us all awake after lunch. So guys, if you could play the movie, please. So I think it's clear that from everyday life all around us, people are using multiple devices along paths to purchase. Some of you may own a husband, some of you may be owned as husbands. I certainly recognize that from my recent experience of moving house, as I frantically reached for any piece of technology to satisfy the boss who wanted a bigger house. And market research can put some numbers against this. So we know, and you will have heard this yesterday from Neil and James, that around 2/3 of consumers move between screens along their path to purchase. We also know that around half of consumers move from the virtual world to the real world. And we know that these consumer behaviors are valuable. So market research tells us that consumers who own multiple devices tend to be more affluent. And it works the other way as well. Consumers are more affluent, tend to own more devices. We also know that consumers who shop across multiple channels are typically more valuable than those who shop just through one channel, either through e-commerce or through offline. These are aggregated numbers from a study by IDC, but I'm always struck, living in the UK, by the quarterly earnings reports and the annual reports that come out from large retailers, talking about the multi-channel behaviors and the values that consumers who undertake those behaviors deliver to their organization. And in recent quarters, organizations like Marks and Spencer and John Lewis have talked about customers who shop across multiple channels being a factor of 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7 and 8 times more valuable than those who just shop along one channel. So it's big, and we think it's worth going after. So it raises the question, how do we measure? The default technology which we've used for a long time on the internet is the cookie. And I find the history of the cookie really interesting. So for those of you who don't know, the cookie was first invented in 1994 by a team which was working for MCI WorldCom. And they used it first to render a virtual shopping cart, which coincidentally is pretty much the same use case which is often used today. The technology was so leading edge that it was included in a browser by the end of 1994. For those of you who've been around for a while, Netscape Navigator built it into their browser version 0.9b. And they used it to differentiate between new and returning customers. Wind the clock forward 20 years, and we're still using the cookie. But there are a couple of things which the cookie really struggles with. The first is when consumers move from one device to another. And the second is when consumers move from the online world to the offline world. So the cookie isn't broken. It's perhaps a little bit crumbly. But it still remains the base technology which we as online marketeers use in order to measure and track consumers. So the question that we've been asking ourselves at Google is, what technologies can we pair up with cookies in order to augment and supplement what a cookie can tell us about how a consumer interacts with a brand, with a website, online? So if we think about our first measurement problem, that of multi-screening, we can drill a little bit deeper into the research to understand more about how this behavior is happening. So if we apply one lens and look at how consumers start their journeys on a smartphone, we know that in many cases they ultimately end up transacting on something with a bigger screen and a bigger keyboard. And if I think about my own behavior, that's often the way I do things. I don't like transacting on anything that's got less than a 7-inch screen. I'm becoming more comfortable with it, so I probably will do some things from start to finish on a smartphone, but in most cases I move from small screen to large screen. If we take the data set and apply a different lens to it, we can see that there is a flow back from the other direction. So in some cases, consumers start on a desktop and then ultimately end up transacting on a smartphone. It's probably more rare, but what is certainly true is that the desktop nearly always gets all of the credit, either just because it does, because we use last-click attribution, or because models struggle to accommodate the fact that it started on a smartphone and finished on a desktop. So the way that we've thought about addressing this problem at Google within our core platforms is by adding together logged-in data together with cookie data to achieve a solution. So within AdWords, we launched a product last October called Cross-Device Conversions. And essentially what this does is it takes logged-in Google data, so where consumers have logged into the Google platforms. We adjust some of the biases in that data. For example, there's normally a bias towards Android because you're pretty much forced to log into Android as a user to get the full functionality and value from it. And for those clients who are using AdWords conversion tracking, we layer on top what we can see. And essentially what we're doing is joining up the dots. So if somebody starts their journey on a smartphone, but ends up transacting on a desktop, or goes the other way from a desktop to a smartphone, we join up the dots and attribute that value back. So that's one way of doing it, using logged-in Google users. Another way of doing it is by using logins to your sites. So I'm sure many of you will have heard that about a month ago, Universal Analytics was launched. That was the full launch that we've been waiting for about 6 months. And with the full launch came a piece of functionality called User ID. Now, User ID allows us to do a number of different things. But in terms of multi-screening, what it allows us to do is where a consumer has logged into your site on a smartphone and on a desktop or a tablet, it allows us to associate the cookies. So essentially, 2 sets of visitor records are associated and become 1 set of visitor records. So you can get a true view of that consumer's path to purchase across devices. There are a couple of ways that that can be used. So within Google Analytics, there are reports which look at device overlap. So essentially, you have a series of circles which overlap between desktop, tablet, and smartphone. And there are also reports which show the relative contribution of each of those devices to an ultimate sale. So we think that between using Google logged-in data, but also giving you the ability to track true cross-device, not just for AdWords, but for any activity, we've got a part of the way to solving multi-screen. If we think about our second measurement challenge, sometimes termed as ROPO, Research Online Purchase Offline, there are a number of different ways that you can address this. There are three classic approaches that have been taken, and we've done all of them over the last 3 to 4 years. So from left to right, we've done tracking studies. So we've used coupons, we've used unique call center numbers, and we've used database matchbacks in order to do a causal linkage between an ad and a click and what's ultimately been transacted in a store or a call center. We've also developed models. So we've had models built, and we've built models ourselves, where we've taken proprietary Google data, which typically means impressions, and query data, absolute or indexed, and built it into either media mix or econometric models. And finally, on the right-hand side, we've also run experiments. So the most common way that we've done it, and we've done it about 80 times now in North America and in Europe, is by running geographic experiments, where we change the level of advertising in certain geographic areas, hold it steady in others, and measure the impact on a seasonally adjusted baseline of offline sales. When clients ask me what's the right way to measure, my typical answer is, I don't think there is a right or a wrong way. Each of these different approaches can tell you different things, and actually the combination of all of them can be really, really powerful. And at the end of my presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how I would set up a measurement hierarchy if I was within a client organization. But we've worked in Europe with all of the brands that you can see up on the screen, and with others. As I say, different approaches yield different metrics and different results. And to be absolutely candid, sometimes these studies don't work. So they're not always positive. But I think 4 of the most interesting metrics are these along the bottom. So reading from left to right, firstly, can I establish some sort of correlation between visits to my website and offline sales? Secondly, if I spend more on online advertising, can I prove conclusively that there's a lift in either category sales or total store sales? Thirdly, if I do spend more money, what's the ROI? So does this activity fundamentally wash its face in financial terms? And fourthly, on the right-hand side, if I observe multi-channel consumers' behaviors, can I pick up some sort of difference in terms of the frequency of purchase or the basket size that makes them different to people who either just research and buy online or who just research offline and buy offline? So I think these are some of the 4 most interesting metrics and KPIs that can come out of studies. And most of the studies that we've done have focused on desktop, which is really a function of 2 things. One, where Google has come from, and secondly also because it has traditionally been easier to measure desktop because there's just been much more traffic coming through desktop than there has on mobile. But recently, we've started to measure mobile. And I'm delighted to say that a few months ago, we published our first global case study conclusively proving that advertising on a smartphone can drive incremental footfall and sales in store. And I'd like to take a few minutes to walk you through this case study with Carphone Warehouse. So I'm sure many of you know Carphone Warehouse as a brand. They operate in the UK and in other European markets. Typically in other European markets, they operate under the name The Phone House. This study was done in the UK, and they have about 850 stores. Although they're quite an advanced multi-channel player, they still rely on those 850 stores for around 90% of their total sales. So the high street's absolutely critical to Carphone Warehouse's success. On the other side, they operate in a sector where a high proportion of demand, Google searches, is done on smartphones. So for those of you who work in the telco sector, I'm sure you'll be aware that when Android or iPhone launches come out, the big ones that are typically in sort of March, April, and September, anything up to 2/3 of queries come through smartphones. So if you add those 2 things together, the reliance on that store network to drive the business's performance and the role that smartphones play, understanding the mobile to store effect is absolutely critical for a business like Carphone Warehouse. So to measure the mobile to store effect, Carphone Warehouse and we partnered on a study. So we put together a project team of statisticians, some of whom were based in our US organization, and Carphone shared with us 2 years of historical sales data for every store in the UK, unit sales and margin for every single week. And we took that data and designed a robust geo-experiment. So we matched up geographic clusters. We have around 24 in the UK which we use. And then we randomized which of those went into the test and control areas. In the test areas, we significantly upweighted mobile search spend, and in the control areas held it flat. And we measured the impact on in-store footfall and sales. Now, there are a number of things that we were measuring, the first of which was footfall. So we could tell through the model when we did the analysis after the test that in the test areas, around 20,000 additional customers visited Carphone Warehouse's stores relative to the control zones. An interesting finding in itself, but what I think is more impactful, is that it cost around $4 to deliver each of those incremental visitors to store. So it got me thinking, what would I pay if I was a retailer for a qualified lead who had researched my brand and products on a smartphone to visit my store? The second finding was around ROI. And when we looked at the test data, we could see that within the test areas, relative to control and to the pre-analysis period, every dollar of additional spend on mobile search drove $5 of in-store margin for Carphone Warehouse. So we believe that this conclusively proves that mobile search can drive footfall and sales in store. Clearly, Carphone Warehouse is a different operating model to many of you, and the results may be very different for you. But we believe that firstly, it's possible to measure it, and secondly, it can be positive in terms of ROI. But as I mentioned in my introduction, our vision has always been not just to deliver one-off studies, but also to enable you to measure on an ongoing basis. So again, we've been thinking about what pieces of data we could take to add on to cookie-based data in order to give that more holistic picture of how consumers research online and buy offline. So within Google AdWords, in the end of last year, we launched a feature called Offline Conversions in AdWords. And essentially what this allows you to do is to take sales data from a CRM system or from a lead gen database and upload that back into AdWords and link a sale to the unique click ID which accompanies every click on Google search. Now, this isn't appropriate for every type of business. My personal view is that it's best suited for organizations that have quite a long lead cycle with a relatively low frequency of purchase. So we've seen organizations who sell in the home and garden space, things like home improvement, who've used this to great effect to link back the offline sales that previously they were blind to, where they could only measure to a lead. Within Google Analytics, we've taken a slightly different approach. So when Universe Analytics was launched, its first phase launch last year, there was a piece of enabling technology called the measurement protocol within it. Now, the measurement protocol in layman's terms basically allows any internet-connected device to be tracked and measured by Google Analytics. So this overcomes one of the classic sort of challenges that many organizations have had, that analytics data on online behaviors has been siloed from everything that goes on in the store and pretty much everything else. So what this enables you to do is, in what's sometimes referred to as the Internet of Things, any device that can send a pulse and a message through the internet, and that could be a smartphone, a desktop, a connected kiosk within one of your stores, a point of sale terminal, literally anything that can send a message via the internet can communicate with and be tracked by Google Analytics. And it's enabled by a simple piece of code. So essentially, what this is a call on a Google Analytics server, and you can see that it's basically saying an event has happened, hello, I'm this machine, and I'd like to say that something has happened. One of my favorite examples of how this can be used is a little bit random, but I think it brings to life the power of this. So at the Google Analytics conference about a year ago, a group of engineers and product managers in a side room had a fridge connected up to the internet. And up on a screen, they had Google Analytics, Universe Analytics running. And when they opened the door on the fridge, you could see in real time, in Analytics, that an event had been recorded at that fridge. And then when they took a product which had a barcode on it and flashed it across a barcode reader within the fridge, that information went in real time into Google Analytics, and the audience could see it on the screen. And it had both the event and it had the SKU, the SKU, of that product that had passed across the barcode reader. Now, I think for most of us, internet-connected fridges are probably not directly relevant to our day jobs, but when you think about the ability of Universe Analytics to capture a signal from any internet-connected device, and you combine that with cookie data, essentially anonymized records held about a consumer's behavior, it allows you to deploy it in these sorts of use cases. So where a journey is started online and being completed in a call center, or where a journey started online and been completed through a face-to-face interaction, or indeed anything that's recorded on a loyalty card and held within a CRM system, all of that can be fed back into Google Analytics, linked up to the cookie ID, and used to optimize against. So within one analytics package, you now have the ability to record on and offline behaviors and use that for the optimization of your marketing campaigns. I think that's hugely exciting. And we're seeing analytics companies and clients starting to really innovate with this, tying back in footfall data, tying back in interactions at kiosks within stores, and linking that back into their online analytics, correlating those numbers against another metric, and making decisions off the back of it. And I think we're really just at the start of this journey. As I say, Universe Analytics was fully launched a month ago, and I'm really excited to see how companies are going to start innovating with this technology, which is now in their hands. So I've talked about the journey which we've been on as Google, moving away from one-off studies with clients, which I think were very valuable in order to show what's possible in terms of measurement of online to offline, and talked about the platform developments within Google Analytics and Google AdWords. Raises the question, so what would I do next if I was in your shoes? And I certainly wouldn't want to suggest exactly what you should do, but I'll offer you 3 thoughts. The first is around micro-conversions. I've talked a lot about measurement, either through one-off studies or through using tracking through Google Analytics or feeding data back into AdWords. But fundamentally, using micro-conversions is, I believe, still valuable. You don't always have to have a 100% precise metric in order to start developing some hypotheses, some ideas, and optimizing against them. And every retailer that I speak to knows what the conversion rate is when they get a qualified lead into a call center or into a store. So I firmly believe that things like call center leads and store locator lookups are still valuable and should be used to develop hypotheses. My second thought is that, as I said before, no one measurement technique is right or wrong. And if I had the luxury of resource and time, I would use all of those different approaches, because I think they work together really quite well. And the way I think about it is of a pyramid. So down here you have tracking. And tracking can be done through the analytics packages that I've talked about. It can also be done through things like couponing, a simple but effective mechanism to establish a ratio between on and offline purchases. Even if the sample sizes from couponing or from analytics aren't huge, you can extrapolate, and you can then do some modeling. And I see modeling as a way of developing some ideas, some hypotheses. If we spend more, will we get more? And will the ROI be positive? And that's where testing at the top of the pyramid comes in, up here. Now, testing has always been quite difficult to do in a robust way. But I think there's some really good news here, which is that I'm seeing more and more agencies developing high-class, robust testing methodologies and using those to work with their clients in order to test things like online to offline. At Google, we're also productionizing the tools that we've been using for a while. So the tools that we use to run the Carphone warehouse case study, which I shared with you, are currently being developed by our product managers, and within a few quarters will appear within one of our platforms. I don't know if it'll be AdWords or Analytics, it might be both, but will appear as a self-serve tool to enable our clients and agency partners to run robust experiments. So watch this space. And my final thought is a very simple one, which is that I'm still passionate about this and believe that it's important. And I think the reason that it's important for any multi-channel organization, as Tobias said at the beginning of his intro, if you think about 80–90% of all sales coming through offline, 2/3 of those being influenced by digital, it's important to understand both the on and offline sales being driven by online in order to understand the full ROI and optimize effectively. So it's hard, and it doesn't always work, and I've had a few experiences like that, but it's worth persevering on because it is fundamentally very important. And the organizations which have cracked this win. And we've seen that, I've seen it personally in the UK market, that organizations that can get a handle on ROPO, that can put a figure against it, can start to compete, particularly against some of the pure players within the Google auction. So that's the end of my presentation. I think we've now got time for some Q&A. I hope you found that interesting. If any of you have cracked ROPO or multi-screen in a different way, then I'd love to hear about it. So over to you. Have we got... Have we got some microphones for Q&A? Any questions? Great.
Hi.
Hello.
I was wondering how long you ran the test for with Car from My House.
We ran it for a total of 10 weeks. So the way we typically run these things is we have a period when we change the media exposure. So we either upweight or downweight, and then we have an observation window afterwards. In this case, it was 3 + 7 weeks. And the reason we do that is because we want to essentially accompany as many consumers along their path to purchase as possible. So, if you've got an average journey length of 10 days or 20 days, you want to make sure that from the last day of the period when you made the media change, in the case of Carphone, that was at the end of 3 weeks, we would want to track all of those consumers who have been exposed to a change in the media through to their ultimate purchase. The length of a test will vary based on the category and that average journey. It also becomes a little bit more challenging the more weeks of data you add on of offline sales data to pick something up, because you're cumulatively adding a lot of offline sales data. But having a length of test which tries to capture as many consumers along that path to purchase as possible is, we think, a good idea. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Hello.
I think that there's a fair amount of consumers that they have a different approach than the research online and purchase offline. The opposite, they research offline and then purchase online because maybe they're trying to find a bargain or discount code, etc. Have you ever studied this phenomenon, and how could be the best framework for a retailer to understand the effects of this?
Very good question. The short answer is no, we haven't done a huge amount of it in terms of measurement studies. The only way we've approached that is through surveys like the Consumer Barometer, which we run across 35, 36 markets, where we ask questions about channel behavior. And one of the questions we have asked in there is about how offline influences online. I think we should be doing more, particularly given the role of mobile and the fact that we know that consumers use mobile to look for local offers, to check social interactions, Google+, Facebook, for local promotions being done. So I'm afraid I don't have the answer, but I think that we need to start doing more of it. And now is the right time because there is the volume of traffic, particularly on mobile, which warrants it. Can I ask the question back? So do you have any ideas as to how that could or should be measured?
I think that the only way is to an extensive field surveys or online surveys. So far, that's what I was thinking about.
I mean, there must be some way of linking back, particularly if it's a promotion that's been discovered and activated on a mobile. There must be some way of causally linking it back to the advertising and then right through at the other end to the redemption. We don't have that technology immediately available. It might come at some point with Google Wallet, but I'd certainly like to, in the interim, develop some sort of methodology which gets us closer to that.
I was thinking about if a retailer offers a Wi-Fi connection in store to a logged-in user, that data is fed into analytics, then maybe
yes.
If he concludes then the transaction online and is a logged one, then you may be able to connect the dots.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. And there are companies that are experimenting with Wi-Fi logins, particularly looking at footfall. Wi-Fi is obviously a richer signal than iBeacons, which are more about pushing rather than two-way communication. But logged-in Wi-Fi users should enable that sort of tracking, both of the pushed message and what comes back. So I think that may hold the answer. Any other questions?
So I have a question about also the case study. I assume this is also a multi-channel company, and from what you were testing was only the mobile decrease of advertising. Have you also taken account activities on other channels, marketing activities, or were those linear? Because those also affect online activities. So how did you deal with that, or did you take that into effect, what was going on other channels?
So when you're doing geo-targeting, A/B geo-testing, essentially all other channels need to remain the same. So that the only thing that you're changing within the mix is your online advertising. Because as you say, there are many influences. We know of the role of offline media in driving online. So one of the key things is that everything else remains broadly the same. The model can accommodate some tweaks and some nuances in other factors. And in retail, that's always the case because, if I look at Carphone Warehouse, they're changing their promotional offers almost daily. But essentially, you rely on everything else remaining the same. So you're making a short, sharp change in any one medium, which means that you can isolate that is what drove the effect. The process of randomization means that you're not manually matching markets together, which is something which other methodologies use. So we do pair the markets based on historical sales, but then we essentially toss a coin about 500 times to work out which of the pair goes into test or control. So this test was done at a 95% statistical significance, which is the sort of default for academic testing, and our statisticians believe that it was robust. What it doesn't tell us is, to your final point, around diminishing returns. So if we ran the test and had spent twice as much money or half as much money, what it doesn't tell us is where that client is on the curve of returns. In order to work that out, you'd have to run multiple experiments to understand if I spent twice as much, would I get twice as much money back? Or if I spent half as much, would I get half as much money back? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I have another. So this is under the assumption that all other marketing activities are kind of linear. But for example, in my company, it fluctuate during the time period. Sorry. So it fluctuates during time. So sometimes it's more heavy on other channels, sometimes not so much. So how do you then tackle with this issue? Because we can't keep it the same all the time and just change one thing because all the other channels are changing constantly.
So as long as those things are changing at a national level and are not regional, then the model can accommodate that. If there is significant variation in offline media at a regional level, for example, a massive upweight in TV advertising within the northwest region of the UK, then it will invalidate the model and any findings would be completely flawed. So one of the great things about geo-testing is that if you can get it right, you're isolating that one thing has changed in the mix. But it does rely on a retailer not doing significant regional advertising because otherwise it skews the results. Any other questions? Struggling to see into the lights at the back. We got any more coming?
I don't see any hands going up, but while we're waiting for the audience, because you've given us a great presentation, David, and very insightful if you're working in multi-channel retail. Just a question to the audience yourself. How many of you have a culture of designing tests, measuring the outcomes, and then implementing a strategy for online to offline at this moment? One, more or less, two, three out of the whole audience. How many of you think that this would be relevant for your business this year? So it looks like we have some work to do. So a question that comes to my mind is a very practical one for you, David, is where do they start? These 75 people who just point up their hand and said, well, I want to start doing these kinds of tests and understanding the effect for my business. Where are they going to start?
So I would start simple and build on that. I would start by looking at survey data And if I didn't already have questions about multi-channel behavior within my store exit surveys or my point of sale surveys or follow-up, then I would start to include those. I wouldn't deluge consumers with too many additional questions, probably a maximum of 2 or 3, but the obvious ones about use of the website, use of store locators, and that sort of thing. Secondly, I would value micro-conversions. If I was in your shoes, I wouldn't change my overall media mix based on micro-conversions, but I would use them to develop some hypotheses and to try to change the lens by which I value online advertising. Thirdly, if there's a media mix model, which is either being operated in-house or is being operated by an agency on your behalf, it should have digital data in it. Some old models struggle to accommodate the detail that we know and love within online advertising about impressions and clicks. But if a model is constructed properly today, and we've shown this with models built for Carrefour, IKEA, AXA, it is possible to include search data within a model. And I think in 2014, there really is no excuse for a modeler building a model which doesn't include digital. And finally, if I had the capacity, I would run some tests. You may only want to run one test and use a rule of thumb which is derived from that. And if I think of organisations in the UK, is anybody here from Currys, Dixons? Any hands gone up?
No.
Yeah. Hi. Jeremy Fennell, who's the e-commerce director, has spoken at a couple of our conferences. They ran a test on desktop, and they've run a number of tests on mobile. And from those tests, they've derived a ratio that for every £1 I spend in online advertising, I get a certain number of e-commerce sales, and I get some sort of contribution towards store sales. And that number was fed into the model, which is operated by their modeling agency, who are part of the WPP agency network. And they use that as a rule of thumb in order to influence their decisions. You can go to the other end of the spectrum. Is anybody here from Vodafone? Yeah. So Vodafone in the UK have talked at some of our conferences about the process they went on. They did one test, which we organised and paid for. In terms of the measurement, they paid for the media. And they wanted to check the learnings that they derived from that. So they did, I think, 5 follow-up tests within the 18 months afterwards to really check on different propositions, different pricing, different parts of the country, what the response rate was going to be. They also commissioned a new model, media mix model, because they felt the previous one wasn't fit for purpose. And they revisited their online attribution model, beyond last click. So if you think of the sort of holy trinity of beyond last click attribution, modeling, and experiments, they did all of those. So they're really at the sort of far end of rethinking the whole way that they built their marketing plan off the back of the multi-channel impacts.
Very cool.
So that's how I think about, you know, from smaller steps to bigger steps, depending on resource and budget.
It's an interesting point and an answer to my question. Thank you for that. Do we have an audience question in the meantime, or are you still processing everything that David shared with you? You're still processing? Okay, because I've got another question that I think is also highly relevant for the multi-channel retailers that we have here today. So in terms of, you've mentioned a couple of roles which we have in your team. You said something about statisticians, data analysts, et cetera, et cetera. Could you give us like and I'm going to get to a second why I think this is, why I think this is important in a second. But could you give us the 3 main roles you think contributed to your team's success? So the 3 areas of expertise in doing these tests and analyses.
3, as in role
like,
holders?
Yeah, like a statistician or a data analyst or a strategist.
So it won't necessarily be 3, because I'm thinking on my feet here.
Yeah.
But we used statisticians to assess historical data and to design a robust test and then analyze the data.
Yeah.
We used people within our sales teams or agency side or within client organizations who could change the campaigns in a way which matched the test design. So in most tests, we've done upweights and we focused on generics. There is no handbook on exactly how to do these things, but it requires quite a lot of skill to ensure that you generate significant, if you're upweighting, you generate additional traffic and don't just push the CPCs through the roof. So those two roles were key.
And anyone.
And those are probably the two that I'd say are the most important.
Okay. And the design of the test, how did that come about? Who was instrumental in that? Was that you?
It depends on the test. So we've done everything from relatively simple coupon-based tests, and I've designed some of those, and we work with clients who have come up with their own ideas, through to using Google's statisticians. So we have a team called the Quantitative Marketing Team, which developed the approach which was used for Carphone Warehouse and is now involved in the productionization, if that word exists, of the testing tools that I talked about. They're a hardcore team of 15 to 20 PhD statisticians, and they've designed something which is a very, very complicated but robust methodology, which draws on its principles from medical testing.
Perfect, thanks. So I'm just going to take that back to the audience, and I'm looking specifically at the people who, when I said, who wants to start doing these kinds of tests in your company? Can you just raise your hands for me again? Don't be scared, I'm not going to bite. Right? That's already fewer hands after this story. And for those of you who just raised your hands, one question. Do you have either a statistician working in your team or someone who is an expert at managing and optimizing all of these campaigns? Do you have that mix? Do you have those two roles in your company at this moment? Anybody? 1, 2, 3 out of 4, out of maybe 25 or 30 hands going up. So does that mean that for the future, remember James Cashmore described a world yesterday, the first presentation we had, James Cashmore described a world that was coming into being, that was changing at a rapid rate, that was very data-driven. That when you had access to the data, you would be able to do more and do more better. So does that mean that, from what we've just seen, that the structure of e-commerce and marketing teams in our multi-channel retailers, in our traditionally high street retailers, actually would need an upgrade? They would need to interact more with, for example, statisticians. Don't think they all need to hire PhDs, but is that a piece of advice or something that they would need to consider?
It's definitely worth thinking about. And if those skills within your organization aren't necessarily embedded within the e-commerce function, the online marketing function, then the question I would ask is, where else within the organization can I find people with those skills? Because I'm sure that in many of your organizations, there will be people with a statistical background. And it's just a question whether those people sit in market insights, sit in controlling, sit in sales finance, whatever you call the function, but there will be some of those people somewhere. If you're thinking about designing tests, assessing offline sales data is conceptually very similar to assessing online sales data. Typically it's bigger, and therefore there's more noise in the data. But actually it's the same sort of rigor. So those skills are not just going to be deployed on ROPO testing, but should be deployed on all sorts of testing, irrespective whether the sale comes through a smartphone, a desktop, or ultimately through a point-of-sale terminal in a physical store.
Very good. Thank you very much. In the meantime, do we have, I'm going to reiterate that we invited David up here because of his wealth of experience. You've seen the companies he's worked with, which we've done the test with, which was one of his first slides. He has a wealth of experience in designing and setting up these tests. Has any of you any challenges related to, well, how would you go about inside your own company gaining the commitment or the buy-in to starting these kind of programs? Maybe he can share some of his experience of how easy or how hard the process in setting up such a program is. Does anybody have a question related to that topic? So, did someone? Who said? Did a hand go up? There you go, sir. Thank you.
Tobias is relentless, isn't he?
Just making sure they get the most out of your precious time.
Hello.
That's really insightful. Thank you for that. And it's something. So I'm a multi-channel retailer from a brand and marketing perspective, but working alongside e-com. And I think where I'm at the moment is, how do I start to think about what's the right structure? So I think I've got some PhD who crunches numbers. I've got people in the finance team that do that. I've got traditional insights team who look at quant and qual research, and I've got CRM and I've got data. And I think the challenge that I've got at the moment is, how do I start to align the different teams to start to think as one holistic customer, either if it's online or offline? And it'd be interesting in the work that you did with Carphone Warehouse, what happened next? So they did that research. How do they change their structure? How do they change the way that they start to work? So they start to live and breathe that, I think, is the biggest challenge that, well, I've got two, which is, A, how do I create it? B, then how do I then start to take it forward within the organisation?
Yeah.
That's a number of questions.
There's a number of questions, and I'm trying to unbundle them. And I think, firstly, a comment on Carphone Warehouse. This was interesting and insightful, and I think it set a load of things running within their organisation. I won't share the details of what that is because it wouldn't be proper, but there are a number of projects which have been kicked off in order to try to learn more about it. In terms of the questions you've raised, I think there are 2 or 3 in there. One is about sponsorship. Where is the right place within the organisation to sponsor this? And typically, if I think of most of the engagements we've done, we've started either with marketing director, if they have responsibility for on and offline, or we've started with multi-channel director or both. In my experience, if it starts purely from the online marketing team and they try to push their way through, then often it can be very challenging for them to get the whole organisation to change. So it's absolutely critical to get the buy-in of the people who either own the stores, own a piece of the stores, or own the total marketing and media budget. Because otherwise, even if you get a positive result, the learnings often aren't then embedded within the organisation. In terms of bringing those different functions together, I wouldn't pretend that it's not a challenge. So you can do a test as a one-off, get everybody around the table who nods, signs off, you get a positive result. But as you've talked about, you've got classic analytics, you've got CRM and loyalty, you've got marketing, you've got sales. There are different components there, and I think every organisation is going to be different in terms of which of those teams need to be brought closer together within the organisational structure, and in some cases even going so far as giving people new objectives and new compensation models based on multi-channel effects, rather than just the online team gets paid based on online sales and the offline media team gets paid on something else which may just relate to the stores. And I think that will be different in every organisation. I've seen examples of where it has been done, but from a Google perspective, I wouldn't pretend that that is an easy thing to do, and it's going to be different in every case.
And did you spend time working with the agencies? So, for example, when it came to some of the analytics, the WPP agencies, when it comes to measurement and metrics, is that something that you did with Carphone Warehouse, or would you do?
With Carphone, we work directly with Carphone and with their performance agency, Adobe, formerly Efficient Frontier. In other cases, we have and would work with agencies naturally. And from a very simple Google perspective, we don't want to be the guys who are just sort of holding a bit of the knowledge. We want other people to be able to do it. And agencies are a very useful enabler of that. Where they can learn to do it, they'll do it again.
Great, thanks.
Was that an answer to your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So you're slowly seeing people from the other session file back in, which is great because we're going to have a full room for the end of the event. But in the meantime, David, while we're waiting for another question to come out of the audience, what I find very curious about your story is I saw some big names, some big companies up there which we worked with, and at the level of the directors, at the highest level in these companies. And I think that might also be relevant for the people in our audience, their bosses, their managers. What were the main arguments up there to say, we're going to do this? What were the drivers behind the rationale to engage in a costly, time-consuming, resource-consuming test with you?
Put simply, that online and e-commerce is fascinating, and I think it's why we all live in that world, because it's been growing at double-digit percentages in most of our markets. But in many of these retailers and retailing organizations, offline is still the heartbeat of the organization, rightly or wrongly. It delivers the lion's share of the revenue and of the profit. And therefore, understanding how you can influence the 90% rather than the 10% is absolutely critical. And that is a real allure and magnet for this.
So the 90% in relation to the 10%, that's the 90% of people
Yeah.
who buy offline?
Yeah, I'm thinking more about revenue. I mean, that's an average stat, but you know, whether it's 80%, whether it's 90%, whether it's 70%, if you can move that number by another 10%, it's the simple maths of it's a bigger number than moving the e-commerce numbers by another 10%.
So if I translate that into that would mean that this is a crucial business objective for the future growth of the companies. They're saying this is important for us, not right now, but 2 or 3 years down the line.
And I can only speak about the UK market, but there are a number of UK retail CEOs who've made comments along the lines of online could be the saviour of the high street, and particularly mobile.
That's interesting. Thanks for that. Is that just a question back to you? So you just heard David say, well, online could be the savior of the high street. Without giving away too much or anything, but is this something that you recognize, that the online contribution to your business is actually very significant in how well you're doing today? Could I see a show of hands who recognizes that statement? Seeing some doubtful hands going up. So it's not something that's per se relevant for all of you. All right, interesting for us to know. Thank you very much. We're going to close off David's presentation after one final question. Is there a final question in the room? Last question. Here, up here. Could I get the Android microphone down here? Almost.
Hello.
Hi. Hi.
Hi.
I have a question on the test that you run. We actually conceived the similar test in theory. We haven't started it yet. I'm work agency side.
Right.
And we have tried to answer the question of maybe slightly smaller, actually trying to see the value of mobile on desktop, because of course the only estimated transactions that you guys can measure are from logged in data.
Correct.
So we were actually trying to maybe do a test which is basically, it follows the same principle as the one you did with Carphone Warehouse. So geo-targeting.
Yes.
And I had a question on the scale of it. So do you think it will have to be run nationally to be able to, for the data to be consistent and to be actually relevant? Or could it be done on maybe just 2 locations that have similarities between themselves? Would that be enough? From a budget point of view.
Sure. I hate to end on a vague note, but the honest answer is I don't know. I would be surprised if 2 locations would be enough, just because it depends entirely on the category that you're planning to test in, but typically you wouldn't have enough inventory in order to be able to pick something up above the noise. Whether you'd have to do it nationally, I don't know. I'd need to look at the numbers. The question then is what your control is. Are you doing a pre-post type test? Are you comparing it to another market? We've started developing an alpha tool where if we can't do a split A/B geo test, then we take data from another market that business is operating in and use that as a control and basically build a counterfactual. What would have happened if we hadn't done the upweight based on the other control? But I think it really depends on the category, the amount of traffic that can be generated, and the sort of numbers that you need to get above that noise of just standard volatility.
Perfect.
I'm very happy to pick it up afterwards or after the event and knock some ideas around.
All right,
Cool.
brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you very much for that question. And that was the final question for David.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.